So I'm Jahnavi. I know many, but not all of you. And I'm really excited and really honored to introduce Miriam Kaba. She is someone who I really consider one of my greatest teachers, even though I've never met her before tonight. A little bit awkward. And I have been reading her writing for many years and really have learned so much more from her than from many of my formal teachers in life. So I'm going to tell you just a little bit about her, but her bio and her work and the organizations she's co-founded are way too long for me to list tonight, but I'm going to tell you a little bit about a couple campaigns that she's run and one that she's working on right now, if that's okay. So she worked in Chicago for 20 years, more than 20 years maybe, and has just recently returned to New York City. She organizes in the areas of gender justice, racial justice, prison abolition, transformative justice, and has worked on some of the campaigns I wanted to talk about are one, to get the city of Chicago to pass a bill to give reparations to survivors of police torture. Another, with a large coalition of folks, I think, working to oust the state's attorney, Anita Alvarez, who was in part responsible for the cover-up of the police shooting of Laquan McDonald. And the campaign one of the campaigns I'm sure that she's working on right now, one of many, I'm sure, is around the case of Brescia Meadows, who is a 15-year-old who's currently detained pretrial, who's a survivor of domestic violence and is being charged with defending herself against her abusive father. So I hope that she gets to talk about that. So please join me in welcoming Miriam Kaba.
So I don't do photographs or images or video, so I'm going to be standing over here. It's not because I don't like you on this side, which is why I'm also standing here. So they turned it off? Okay, you turned it off. You're great. Awesome. Thank you. So I want to thank the NYU Review of Law and Social Change for the invitation really to join you this evening. I want to thank my fellow panelists who I have so much admiration for in terms of your work. I'm inspired by all of you. All of you are younger than me. I hate that. I really do. But I'm so inspired. I can't believe what's going on right now, and I can't believe I get to live in this moment. And I want to thank all of you for being here tonight. So Sterling Brown, who's a folklorist and a poet, wrote a poem in the mid-1930s. It's a poem called Southern Cop. And I'd like to open with that poem. Let us forgive Ty Kendricks. The place was Darktown. He was young. His nerves were jittery. The day was hot. The Negro ran out of the alley, and so Ty shot. Let us understand Ty Kendricks. The Negro must have been dangerous because he ran. And here was a rookie with a chance to prove himself a man. Let us condone Ty Kendricks if we cannot decorate. When he found what the Negro was running for, it was too late. And all we can say for the Negro is, it was unfortunate. Let us pity Ty Kendricks. He has been through enough. Standing there, his big gun smoking, rabbit scared, alone, having to hear the wenches wail and the dying Negro moan. So it's long been open season against Black people in this country. That's not new. And that poem by Sterling Brown is a poem that's been written over and over again since the 1930s and was written before the 1930s. So we know that this is a long, long history and that we are living still in the afterlife of slavery and that chattel slavery was also not the beginning and that anti-Blackness precedes that. And so that it's important for us to understand the context within which we live and the context that we have to continue to struggle in order to be able to get to what we hope, for me, is an abolitionist end. My friends at Critical Resistance tell us that policing, at its very core, is structured to use force to maintain laws that disproportionately target poor brown and black people, indigenous people, youth, and queer and trans people. I would add people with disabilities. Policing, as it exists, is not a broken system. It works exactly as it was meant to. Therefore, we must keep imagining and fighting for a world without police. I think for many, many people, that terminology, that turn of phrase, that the system is not broken but works as designed, has not been credited to the source of that. The people who popularized that idea were the people who started Critical Resistance in 1998, an organization that I think more people should know about and more people should support, because they've been part of establishing an intellectual scaffolding for us that takes us from the 1970s, when white feminists actually were abolitionists, anti-prison organizers. I know that sounds shocking, because like, who are the white people doing that today, especially the white women feminists, who are actually carceral mostly in the way they try to solve problems. They have a history and a legacy they could go back to if they wanted to. So it's really important to think about the legacies that we have around the ability to be able to frame these ideas and who gives us the intellectual scaffolding upon which we stand so that we can fight stronger and smarter. So I'm going to talk about an abolitionist campaign that I co-led that was referenced earlier in Chicago called Reparations Now, as a way to ground the idea of police abolition and to make it concrete for those who tell me regularly that they can't, quote, wrap their brains around the concept. I think I thought Abe's point is so apt, and I say it all the time, that for many white people, they're already living an abolitionist present. Yeah? They never see cops, except when they call them. The police are doing work for them in other communities, the ones we live in. When Johnny gets caught with drugs, he gets treatment and support, not punishment and banishment. They're already living an abolitionist presence, so it's not hard to wrap your brain around it at all. The question is, why not for our kids too? Really is the question. So I want to say that my abolitionist vision and practice about ending policing is guided by three main questions. The first question is, how do we reduce contacts with police? How do we reduce contacts with police? I learned about this through working with young people, mostly young black people, who years ago when I was like in my delusional state, I was offering things like having relationship building opportunities with the cops. That's about 15 years ago, maybe 20 years ago. And it was a young person who said to me, Ms. Kaba, I don't need to know the cops. They know me and I know them. I don't want a relationship with them. I want them to leave me alone. That was the beginning for me of a shift in thinking about the fact that they wanted less contact with the cops, and that was in and of itself an abolitionist demand. The second question that I want to make us think about and ground us in is, how do we erode police power? That the reforms and the policies that people are currently proposing, if they do not meet the test of answering the question, are those reforms and policies reducing and eroding police power, then they are not abolitionist demands. It's a very easy way to test yourself and figure out whether or not what you're offering is actually increasing the strength of the very institutions you want to dismantle. How do we repair harm caused by policing? Is the third question that we must wrestle with and that we must ground our ideas and thinking and struggle around. I also want to point out, as my friend Rachel Herzing has said, that the problem of policing extends well beyond the horror of people being killed by cops. Yep. And because of that, remedies must get at the heart of the role cops play rather than the most extreme demonstration of their power. What that means, really, is that stop killing us is a completely woefully inadequate demand.
Absolutely.
And that if we are organized around that as our demand, we are sure to be losing. We will always lose, because cops are not killing enough of us for us to make that the central demand in this moment. It is too limiting. It doesn't actually explain the problem. If you don't explain the problem and you don't have an understanding of that, you cannot get to a solution that makes sense. So I think what we need in this moment is to reshape and redefine our vision of what justice means. We cannot settle for the tinkering around the edges, for reforms that actually strengthen policing, prisons and surveillance, that Marbury brings up this point of surveillance that we leave out of the Holy Trinity, which we should not, because it's incredibly important. And Black people have been surveilled since the first Black person set foot on this continent, surveilled in multiple kinds of ways. And if we don't wrestle with that, we cannot address the overarching need to dismantle the entire PIC. We cannot settle for individual indictments that are mostly symbolic, or for body cameras on police that are more likely to be turned on the public than on the cops. Yep. We have to restructure the ways we interact with each other in order to make the police the last rather than the first people we call in emergencies and non-emergencies. We have to decouple the things like mental health response from policing. Why should people with guns be doing wellness checks? That means that's on us as a polity, as people, to give actual job descriptions to the police that are incredibly limited. And by the way, the cops tell us this all the time. They do not want to be social workers in schools. So why not get them out of there? That would be a good way to move forward. Importantly, we have to abolish capitalism if we are to successfully end police as an institution. Gotta do it. Got to do it. You cannot talk about the police aside from talking about capitalism. The police protect property. They do not protect people. And so the idea that we're going to actually be able to solve this issue by remaining in this capitalist horror show is like complete delusion. I only have a very short time this evening, so I'm instead of focusing on the first two questions around how do we reduce contact with the police and how do we erode police power, I'm happy to talk more about that if we get a chance to have more of a discussion later. I want to talk about how we repair the harm caused by policing. And I'm guided by Amilcar Cabral's admonition. Okay. Always bear in mind that the people are not fighting for ideas, for the things in anyone's head. They are fighting to win material benefits, to live better and in peace, to see their lives go forward, to guarantee the future of their children. I think that when I think about that, and I read a lot, and I love books, and I'm gonna get you to read a lot. I don't care. Every time before I left Chicago, a lot of young folks did some really nice things for me that I've been working with for years. One of the things was a video, and they asked people, what did Miriam teach you? And almost everybody had keep reading, because I believe in that. I think you gotta read it to understand the world. And so Cabral really teaches us something about abolition is not a set just of ideas that people should be keeping in their heads, but about a fight to actually improve the material needs of people in order for them to be able to live livable lives in the world. And so I spent almost over 20 years in Chicago before moving back home a few months ago, as it was said. And in Chicago, between 1972 and 1991, there was a kind of cabal called the Midnight Crew, led by an officer named John Burge. And that group of police officers tortured over 110 that we can document Black people. And when I say torture, I mean real torture. I mean suffocating people with plastic typewriter bags to try to get them to give false confessions. I mean putting people on radiators and making sure that they were hit so that they fall on the radiator and burn their stomachs. I mean, using electrical prods and putting them on people's ears and on their genitals and shocking them. Playing Russian roulette with people with loaded guns. I'm talking torture engaged in a city calling itself modern for over 20 years. And it took families and most importantly, the survivors of that torture, to start in the early 80s into the mid-80s talking about what happened to them from behind bars, representing themselves pro se in court to say that they had been tortured and no one listened. There were a few people who started to listen, and interestingly enough, they were lawyers. But they were movement lawyers. They were movement lawyers who understood that litigation wasn't going to be enough, but that litigation would help get a story out and create a record. And they began that documentation in that fight, and they partnered in communities like in the south side of Chicago, where Black People Against Torture and other groups were also beginning to sound the alarm that this was happening in their neighborhoods. The cops were picking people up, torturing them, getting them on false confessions, and then putting them on death row. Over 12 of the torture survivors were on death row. They almost died until Governor Ryan, years later, commuted all their sentences, and we ended up abolishing the death penalty in Illinois. The fight for the abolition of the death penalty was intimately tied to the Burge torture cases. Just to give you a sense that when we talk about movements, that movements are always building upon the past in order to be able to stand in the present. And that if you don't understand that you can get nowhere without looking at who came before you, who was fighting before you, and how they did, then you're not going to ever be successful in what you're currently fighting for. So what I know for sure is that I got to know over the years torture survivors and their families, and I was incredibly moved by their stories. But the fight at the time was prosecution. That we were going to go after Burge and we were going to prosecute him and we were going to find a way to get people in court and get them to admit to what they had done. And I knew we would fail because the legal system cannot support that. Why? Because the system will never tell on itself. It will never indict itself. We cannot rely on it for, quote, justice. And so for years, people fought and they got Burge fired in 1993. And then years more of investigative journalism and organizing to get Burge to be brought up on federal charges by the DOJ. He goes to court, torture survivors testify, and they can get him on lying about torture. And he gets a sentence of 4 years in prison. After doing that to dozens and dozens of people, after destroying communities, that's 4 years. People were despondent. What are we gonna do now, right? We fought for the justice in the courts, and it has failed us. And meanwhile, the survivors and their families are left with nothing, no material way to be able to make their lives better. Waking up with nightmares and cold sweats, no psychological counseling. So all that fighting, only a few people getting a few civil determinations in terms of money, but the vast majority of survivors and their families left behind. So it was in that context that in 2010, a group of artists, lawyers, organizers, survivors, and their families came together to form something called the Chicago Torture Justice Memorials, which was to take an idea about using art to think about what was possible in terms of memorializing the cases of torture that happened. They invited the community through a set of town halls, charrettes, and other things to start talking about what to do now that basically they'd exhausted everything. It was at that time that I got officially more involved in the fight by joining the advisory board of the Torture Justice Memorials. When it was clear that no longer were we going to be focusing mainly on a prosecution, indictment, legal strategy, then I could get involved in a different way, to think about how we as a community would come together to create something different, to imagine something else, to create a more transformative and expansive view of justice than the justice we'd been fighting for 30 years before that. So just a long story short, last year in May of 2015, the Chicago mayor and the city council passed the first ever reparations law in a municipality in America. Yes, the first ever reparations law in a municipality in the US that is dedicated towards people who were violated by racist law enforcement. And I want to say two things about that. I want to say that it's really important that we fought to call it reparations. Because we were not just fighting for those survivors in that moment in the city of Chicago, but fighting for everybody else to be able to stand on that example, to call for reparations more broadly, and to say that it's possible for us to win. We were told very early on that no one would pass this reparations ordinance. We were told that it was impossible, that Rahm Emanuel, no one would actually do this, right? And it's really important that when people tell you no, 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 that you always respond with why not, why not, why not? Because it is possible. And it makes sense that it would be possible because I'm standing here because somebody thought it was possible to abolish chattel slavery, even when people said it was not going to be done. That matters. You got to have people saying why not and fighting and continuing to struggle anyway. So I want to say that for the campaign, I was a co-lead organizer of the campaign. There were 4 organizations that were the lead organizers for the reparations campaign. It was CTJM that I mentioned, Amnesty International, Project NIA, and We Charge Genocide. And I don't have time to talk about We Charge Genocide in depth, but I can't tell you what an amazing opportunity it was for me to work with this group of young people as part of We Charge Genocide, to take the case about what was going on outside of this country, to go to the UN, which has its own problems, but to insist that a group of 8 young people of color, black and brown, stood and said to the whole entire world that this was happening in Chicago, that they were being tortured and harassed and harmed by law enforcement, and got everybody on those panels to ask the question to the state right in front of them. Why are you treating black people in your country this way? And having the state have to answer for that. Those young people did something really important, and it was to shame the country, right, from the outside. And I cannot imagine that we would have won reparations had the country not been shamed from the outside. Had they not written in the notes afterwards that the reparations ordinance should pass, that we could use that as a springboard for a 6-month intensive intergenerational, interracial, inter-everything campaign to push during the election period, to push Rahm Emanuel to come to the table and do that. What did we win through the Reparations Now campaign? Beyond the $5.5 million, which is not the thing that was most important to the survivors, though that was helpful. We also won an ability to be able to teach the Burge torture cases in Chicago public schools, starting next fall, to all 8th and 10th graders, so that nobody will ever forget what happened. Very important, very important. We also won a public memorial, which will be erected to the survivors, the torture, and the resistance in Chicago. Nobody will ever forget. Daryl Cannon, who was mightily, horrifically tortured in 1973 and then spent nearly 25 years in prison, 15 of those in TAM Supermax, hell on earth. When he was stood in front of the city council in May to tell his story, to say what had happened to him, and for the mayor then to apologize on behalf of the city of Chicago, he said that he couldn't have imagined when he was in his 6x9 torture 23 hours a day cell. He could not have imagined that moment, that somebody would acknowledge they did it. That mattered to him more than anything. You can't imagine when you've been tortured in this way and nobody believes that you were. For people to believe that 40 years later was really something. We also have now, currently people are building a community center on the south side of Chicago with money from the city to be able to provide specialized counseling services and vocational services for survivors of torture and their families. Survivors have free city college for themselves, their children, and their grandchildren. Wow. Yeah? So I can go on, but the vision of that document, of that ordinance, is an abolitionist document that does not rely on a strategy of going to court, where people cannot win in that kind of way. You have to take your fight outside of the system in order for it to officially be able to, give you what you need. Some modicum in vision for justice. So I want to end by saying that, the Reparations Now campaign was based on a few questions that we ask ourselves in a transformative justice framework. We ask ourselves in a transformative justice framework, what went wrong? What happened? Who has been harmed? And then you center those people. How can we repair the harm? That was the ordinance. What can we do to prevent this in the future? And what is my community's, my state's, and my country's responsibility to aid in that prevention? Those are the grounding questions that led us that we fought for and that we fought together around. It's how we built our strategy. And ultimately, we were able to bring that idea and that vision to fruition within a larger context of the Black Lives Matter movement. And with that, we achieved far more than what any individual criminal prosecution or lawsuit could afford. I'm going to end by quoting Angela Davis, who's a touchstone of mine. In 1970, she wrote, "The American judicial system is bankrupt. Insofar as Black people are concerned, it has proven itself to be one more arm of a system carrying out the systematic oppression of our people. We are the victims, not the recipients of justice. Let it be known that in Chicago, in 2015, some Black people, having been the victims of the criminal legal system, were finally the recipients of a modicum of justice. We can build on this. We must. Onward towards abolition." Thank you.